The parents haven't been scrutinised in the same way that adoptive parents are scrutinised. You think that they might be good parents, but how do you know that?
Obviously, I can't know that entirely, even if someone was scrutinised through an adoptive process. But in this scenario, if they're going to such devoted and great lengths and engaging in a process which I assume would have some degree of regulation, if not the same as adoptive, then I'd still be happy to engage in that process.
It's interesting, you know, I never heard a sperm donor cross-examined about the propriety of their decision. Why should women be singled out for this?
Well, then you should meet me.
In fact, because we rely on donation, we limit sperm donors to people who are comfortable with the notion of donating sperm, which is quite a limiting, I would imagine, statistical band.
But those who are comfortable with it don't get scrutinised as to their ethical position.
They probably do by their auntie. This is her auntie, it's not a lawyer. So her auntie might, she's her trusted auntie.
Yeah, but there's a sense of ethical disapproval I detect.
Besides which...
well, look, I had the same conversation with a godson making a decision to donate sperm. These questions about what do you think about this child as this child matures? Wouldn't you be concerned about what's happening to your child? Do you think that this child, depending on where they are in terms of legislation, that they'll contact you later on?
Carmel, $30,000. Do you care?
Stick to your guns.
Yeah. Look, like I said, I'd be engaging in this process as a donor rather than a parent or someone that would have a paternal role in bringing them up. So it is essentially a commercial transaction. Having said that, though, as well as, relieving myself of my HECS debt, I have the chance to give someone children where they otherwise wouldn't, in a circumstance where I believe that child's going to be born into the best circumstances it possibly could. So
if you wanted to be an egg donor, and you were concerned about your children in any sort of a way, why wouldn't you do it through a proper system rather than some odd couple who
because this one pays more.
Sorry?
This one pays more. If she did it in Britain, the guidelines suggest a recompense of £10. Whoopee.
If she did it here, she gets nothing.
If she did it here, she gets nothing. If she goes to Houston, she gets the bucks.
Even in Houston, she could do it through an organised setup. But that's another question. But, there are setups that you can go through that will pay you a lot of money and will do the screening and so on for the parents.
And would you have a problem with her going through one of those setups?
I have a lot of problems with the whole system.
Thought you might.
But, I guess my first concern would be if somebody were to approach me saying this is what they were thinking of doing, I'd be raising the questions that Beeb has raised in terms of these are your children.
In this instance, though, Carmel didn't call you, so you're off to Houston.
Sure. Just quickly, I'm not opposed to doing this through a regulated means at all.
Ed Byrne, you're being briefed on this drug trial. This is a phenomenal drug. We could cure type 2 diabetes using a pill. This is a joint venture between Sneddon University and ProGenTech, and the results are good across the phase 3 clinical trials in India. But there is this cluster around a single hospital. The cluster is made up of poor people. The cluster is made up of people who do not believe that they ever gave consent to participate in a medical trial. They have all sworn affidavits saying that they were told this was just another form of medication. They have all suffered complete renal failure. They have all described symptoms of malnutrition prior to going on the trial. You've got a great drug here. You could rebuild the Sneddon wing. You've got a problem cluster, and you've got a trial which has gone a little bit AWOL. What are your priorities at this stage?
Well, look, I have encountered situations like this before, and the way to act is quite straightforward. Firstly, the two or three issues here. There's clearly been malpractice in a clinical trial centre in that patients have been enrolled without appropriate consent or information.
Well, we pay clinicians to enrol people, of course.
But we have rigid monitoring of all centres. That centre would be investigated and closed down if that was the only issue. But here we have a more pressing issue. When a university takes on a major clinical trial, it does so, or at hospital, it does so with exactly the same standards of due diligence that you have in industry. So I would have, our university would have Professor Zimmert as the principal investigator who's leading on the trial, and we would have set up through Professor Zimmert an independent clinical monitoring body who would have all adverse effects reported to them on a regular basis, because you can't do a trial without this, and they would then opine as to whether it was safe to continue the trial. We would take that advice totally.
Were it that Professor Zimmert was told about these adverse effects, but he wasn't? Something went really, really wrong at this suburban Delhi hospital, which was one of many that were handling the trial.
Well, how do I know about it if he doesn't know?
Oh, he knows about it now.
Right.
he knows about it now because Julian and Liberty are acting for the plaintiffs. And they're being bankrolled by Lalit Modi, head of the IPL. He's going into the health business. You can't buy publicity like this. Professor Zimmert, you are engaged by Ed Byrne in contemplation of legal action to look at this trial. Based on what you know, do you have any hypotheses about what might have gone wrong?
We have to assume that the earlier trials were successful with minimal side effects, otherwise we wouldn't be in phase 3.
They were.
So, and all of the reservations that Professor Byrne has expressed regarding the ethical issues and an ethics committee and looking at all the data prior to this have been considered. But if this is just a population, for example, a poor population in India, and I think it's worth pointing out why it might be in India, because at the moment India is the epicentre of an epidemic. It's probably the largest epidemic in human history of type 2 diabetes.
How many Indian diabetics are there, Professor Zimmer?
There are something in the range of 50 million. Now, I've just told a lie because 3 weeks ago the New England Journal of Medicine published an article indicating that there are now 90 million people with diabetes in China. But let's go back to India. If this is a group of poor, malnourished people, it's very likely that they would have had some pre-existing liver disease, kidney disease, their immune systems would be affected badly. And so this may be an explanation why in this small cluster of people these horrendous side effects were seen.
They should never have been on the trial.
Absolutely. I mean, normally you would be very careful with your selection of people in a phase 3 clinical trial. You would want to be sure, for example, people with diabetes, many of them would have had pre-existing kidney disease in the first place. And this new drug and their poor immune
it sets
system.
them right off.
Yep.
So what do we do about them, Ed Byrne?
Well, there are a few issues. I mean, firstly, we need to find out what's gone on and whether this is an unusual, isolated circumstance that has another explanation or it's a side effect. If it is a side effect, then normally the independent monitoring committee would recommend that the trial stopped, and we would advised these centres that the trial was stopping. And it has to be stopped at that stage because the longer it goes for, the more rare side effects you see. And there have been many instances, 4 or 5 in recent years, where blockbuster drugs that have been on the market for some years have been shown to have low incidences of dangerous side effects, and they've had to be withdrawn. Drugs like Vioxx, at a cost to the company of billions of dollars, but at the cost of more ill health to the unfortunate people who got the side effects.
Linda Barclay, there's 2 million Indians currently enrolled in Western drug trials with virtually no independent supervision whatsoever. This is just a hypothetical, but surely the trials would never go pear-shaped like this, would they?
Well, again, it would depend on why this particular group of individuals had such a catastrophic reaction. If it was because they were enrolled into the trial by a corrupt local investigator, then it could happen. But on the other hand, even though clinical trials do go through various phases, it is very important for anyone who ever finds themselves thinking about participating in any kind of research to understand that not all risks are known. And certainly the risks for any given individual are not known. People need to understand that participation in research always carries some risks.
Let's be very, very clear about this. These individuals did not believe that they were participating in research.
This is a separate issue, that there's been malpractice in the enrolment of these individuals, and they need to be encouraged to pursue their legal rights to the limit.
And they are. They're about to sue you.
And it's our job to make sure they have all information and their lawyers have all information. And I'm sure that our lawyers would be working with their lawyers to achieve a settlement because the case is indefensible.
Good. That makes your job easy, doesn't it, Julian and Liberty?
Well, Paul Zimmert gave it to us a few minutes ago because we got the protocols on discovery and there was nothing restricting people by reference to socioeconomic groups. So we're very, very happy to hear what he said about malnutrition.
Lalit Modi doesn't stuff around. He said, get Burnside. He's a man of his word. Interestingly, the plaintiffs in this case want a very specific settlement. They want money for their pain and suffering. They want kidneys. And they want a solar-powered water purification device because they're sick of their children dying of diarrhoea. Is there a problem with a group of plaintiffs that want live kidneys as part of a settlement?
Well, it's better than wanting dead kidneys, isn't it?
Well, funny you should say that, because clinically it is. They don't want dead kidneys. They don't want a second-rate solution. They want live kidneys.
You mean kidneys from live donors?
Kidneys from live donors, yes.
Well, it
So
could
I think
potentially...
kidney
Lalit Modi has suggested that this be done in Iran, of course, where he's a man of many strings, but one can do this in Iran. The system is completely government-sponsored, very successfully. But that would take us down a moral cul-de-sac, so let's not go there. No, instead, they are quite happy to have living relatives donate kidneys with a little bit of money for their time, expense and general heartache.
So we're confident that these kidneys will be a good match, that there won't be complications post-organ transfer?
Oh, Lalit Modi assures you that these are all relatives, they are all compatible, and they're all extremely willing to donate their kidneys.
Can you clarify?
Informed
Can you clarify the payment that you're talking about?
Well, that's a good question. What should we pay for a kidney?
Can you clarify the law in India with respect to transplants?
Yeah, I don't believe it's legal to pay for a kidney in India.
I think it is.
Great. That makes life really easy.
It's not legal to buy kidneys in India. It's also illegal in India. But in hospitals in India, people can turn up to a transplant centre with a known relative and say this person altruistically wishes to donate their kidney.
It's a known relative of a different race very often.
And the transplant centre is supposed to have scrutiny of the exchange to ensure that it is altruistic. What tends to happen is that people bribe the members of those ethics committees.
That would never happen under Lalit Modi.
Fair enough.
So can I be clear on this? You say that they're being paid, and you're implying that they're being paid something significant in exchange for their kidneys.
At this stage, to be honest, they're happy to donate their kidneys. Is this a settlement, Liberty and Julian, as advising solicitor and barrister, that you are prepared to countenance?
Well, it seemed to us that the arrangement really is provision of the desal plant and payment of a certain amount of money to each plaintiff, and then in India they will make arrangements to get kidneys in whatever way is lawful and
Indeed they will, but they also want it acknowledged that part of the settlement involves giving us kidneys.
Well,
they're really quite explicit about that.
But it really doesn't, does it?
No.
Because the kidneys are being given to them by relatives after proper informed consent.
So this is the truth that dare not speak its name.
Well, I would have thought it's the truth that would wave itself from the flagpole, because what you don't want to be doing is arranging a settlement by which you are actually forcing kidneys out of one person into the plaintiffs.
But there's ample documentation between the parties, Carmel Wallace, to suggest that that's just indeed what this settlement is aimed at doing.
We know the university suggested that, but we wouldn't go along with that.
No.
And it's completely irrational. This is not a gift that is within the competence of the university to give.
No, we certainly wouldn't support that. I would think that would be an untenable resolution.
Oh, why is it untenable? Because we're not paying them for their kidneys?
No, I mean, what one has to make sure is that these unfortunate people are adequately compensated, and the compensation would include funds to enable them to receive appropriate treatment as legally available through the system. It should also include compensation for other issues and would be...
Can you define what appropriate treatment is?
Well, it would include... They've got renal failure. It would include support for their period of dialysis. It would include whatever costs...
The plaintiffs are very clear. They regard dialysis, rightly or wrongly, as a second-rate outcome.
No, but everybody, if they've got acute renal failure, they have to have a period of dialysis to keep them alive until a renal transplant can be organised.
They want one organised quickly, and they have a means to do it. Their relatives are queuing up saying, we want to donate with a little bit of money.
Their renal failure, though, will still have to be stabilised, and they'll still need a period of dialysis. Yes, and they'll need to be immunosuppressants
for the rest of their life. This is very expensive, but this, I mean, this could turn into a class action that could last years.
That's right, and I think Julian and I would need to have a discussion about how best to advise our clients with respect to their claim, because I'd like to know absolutely they've had medical advice about the likely success of a kidney transplant as opposed to dialysis, because I would feel quite uncomfortable recommending a settlement which might be cheaper on one view and possibly in the interests of the defendants if kidney transplant in fact was cheaper than dialysis.
Well, there's an 80% chance that they would have to have the transplant renewed within about somewhere between 5 and 7 years on average. Yeah.
It's quite a few relatives.
I'm still not clear with this as to what the university is actually agreeing to. They're agreeing to fund, no doubt, the medical expenses.
The university does not presumably want to be dragged into an 8-year-long class action.
But what are they funding in relation to these relatives?
They're funding compensation for pain and suffering. They're funding a small community water purification plant, and they're funding all expenses over the term of these people's life with the replacement of kidneys.
That's what's been asked for. That's what's been asked for, but we haven't agreed to that.
No, absolutely.
When you say compensation, who gets the compensation for pain and suffering? The people who lost their kidneys in the first place, or the donors?
Correct. The people that lost their kidneys, because as things stand, not a whole lot of people want to compensate people who donate kidneys. You know, after the tsunami, we could get a kidney for $1,400 in southern India. The bottom dropped out of the market. We don't pay people very well for kidneys. Linda Buckley, should we pay people properly for kidneys?
You want me to what am I thinking? Channel Julian Savulescu, don't you? So I'll just sit up and adopt an overbearing...
Isn't it great that Iceland actually got their revenge on Britain? Invoke anti-terror laws against us.
You only need to pretend to be something else. I've had to pretend to lose my whole integrity.
All right. Yeah.
Well, she is. She's
there,
been Julian.
There are many respected mainstream philosophers all over the world who do indeed defend a market in kidneys. I don't think any of them defend an international market in kidneys. Because and this goes back to Carmel selling her eggs, if we're even going to for a moment consider a market in human organs or gametes, then we would have to be really confident that that market was regulated to, if not eliminate, at least significantly reduce exploitation and significant physical harm done to sellers or vendors.
At present, there is a market, there is no regulation, there is massive harm done, and the amount paid is simply not transformational in any way, shape or form for the person who donates or sells kidneys. Is that ethically tenable?
Well, we can't necessarily control that international unregulated supply that's so terribly harmful. Let me channel Julian for a minute. We could potentially stamp out that international unregulated, terribly harmful market by setting up domestic regulated markets such that people within their own wealthy country could access kidneys more readily and wouldn't travel to poor countries and prey on the world's most vulnerable. That's exactly why some people argue we should have, within wealthy countries like our own, heavily regulated, compensated kidney donations. We can control the demand. We can't really control the supply side internationally.
Julian Liberty, your clients are quite single-minded. They want first-class medical treatment, they want compensation, they want a replacement kidney, they want all expenses associated with immunosuppressant treatment and any subsequent treatment that they might need for the course of the rest of their life.
Well, there's two ways of doing it. One is to arrange a settlement that gives them enough money to negotiate with relatives or whoever else might provide kidneys. The alternative is to get enforceable orders requiring hundreds of individuals in India to hand over kidneys regardless whether they want to. I think the first is the more likely course. And I don't have an ethical problem with it because it is up to the plaintiffs then to look after the way in which they get replacement kidneys. If that's the path they choose, they might think they can have a much better life on dialysis with the money that they can save. But it's a matter for them.
Yes. But an institution in Australia can't put itself in the business of breaching Indian law. So whatever compensation arrangement is arrived at, it must also be consistent with the law in India.
And there will be nothing inconsistent with the law in India in this settlement. Andrew Way, as a non-executive director of ProGeneTech, what are your considerations?
Yes, it's interesting moving from an executive to non-executive in such a short time. So I guess I want to assure myself that the information I've heard has been thoroughly investigated and management can assure me that what we've heard is correct. I think I want to check that they've understood how this came about and we've prevented harm being continued. I think I then want some sort of understanding of what they intend to do about disclosure in this space. So this is a trial that's very significant and has significant positive impact on the company. I'd want to know how they're going to manage the information that's associated with this part of the trial having not been followed correctly, as I've understood the debate so far. And then finally, I'd want to understand the details of the life cycle costs of this settlement in terms of what's proposed and also the legality of it to assure myself that the company was acting within the bounds of the law it's tied to.
The life cycle costs are massive, but the insurance company indemnifying the trial is prepared to sign off on it, given the reputation of the drug and what's at stake. Paul Zimmet, what would be the impact worldwide of a pill that could cure type 2 diabetes?
I think it'd be enormous. I did mention I think this is probably the biggest epidemic at the moment in human history. The United Nations 2 years ago put up a special resolution at the General Assembly. I think it's the only time ever that every country voted in favour of a resolution that diabetes, type 2 diabetes in particular, would be a international health hazard or disaster. And I think that we should bear in mind that our own Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, stated recently that by 2020 diabetes will be the number one disease in Australia in men and number 2 in women. The economic costs of diabetes are huge. The 4/5 of all the type 2 diabetics in the world are in developing countries. A cure would be enormous in the sense that diabetes is a huge economic cost now, and obviously a huge social and health cost as well.
We want this drug on the marketplace as soon as possible, if it's safe, surely.
Well, I think we're presented with a problem. Where do we go after the Indian experience? I think it's fair to state that things are much more regulated in India than they were 10 or 20 years ago. But we would have to go back to the earlier studies, decide whether the company and, I guess, ethics committees are prepared for a trial to be done in a healthy population, potentially in Clayton, close to Professor Byrne. I think this is the big dilemma now. Is this drug dead, or do we give it another chance?
Professor Byrne, is this drug dead, or do we give it another chance?
Well, that's not up to me. That would be up to an independent scientific monitoring committee who would look at the facts around each of the cases.
What is your hope as Vice-Chancellor of a university that holds the IP to one of the world's potentially most lucrative drugs?
That the right decision is made, because remember, we do clinical trials for 2 reasons. One is to show that the drug works. The other is to see if there are any side effects. About quite a number of clinical trials are stopped because of side effects. Many blockbusters aren't on the market today because there were side effects in trials. The worst thing is where a drug gets through a trial that does have side effects, and because of the number of patients involved in the trial, it's not detected. And then you have a situation like Vioxx, probably the best treatment for some forms of arthritis. Millions of people treated around the world, causes heart disease, off the market. The best anticonvulsant drug I worked with in my time as a neurologist caused people to go blind. That was discovered when it had been on the market for 10 years, taken off the market. So it's in everybody's interest that drugs that cause side effects are detected early before they're released generally.
Julian Burnside, you've been recently involved with litigation with Merck. How do you describe the behaviour of large pharma?
The decision's under appeal, so I have to be careful. I won't talk about Merck, but about other drug
Sorry,
companies.
did I say Merck?
You did.
I meant some
other company.
Mirena.
Yeah. I think it's quite interesting that each year American drug companies spend more on advertising than the American government spends on educating doctors. That seems to me to be a gross misallocation of funds. And on average, in the Fortune 500 list, pharmaceutical companies spend approximately 36% of their budget on advertising and about 10% of their budget on research. I again think that's a misallocation of funds, but of course David may bring the figures down because he's offering himself at a cut price.
Well, David, of course, has been engaged by Progentech to delicately manage this non-story. Should be a nice little learner.
Absolutely.
Ladies and gentlemen, hypothetical means supposed but not necessarily real or true. But I guess an awful lot that is real becomes true even before it's supposed. It's time to end this now, to step outside back into our own realities. But firstly, you should thank our panel.